Hey guys, tonight we're not stepping into the battlefield, nor the dungeon, nor the plague-ridden streets. Tonight we step into something far darker, something more dangerous than war. Marriage, yes, the sacred bond, the holy union, the thing they told you was about love. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't. It was about property, power, bloodlines. And if you think that sounds romantic, you wouldn't last a day as a medieval bride. Imagine this, you're 14. You don't know the meaning of love, but you do know the smell of the chapel wax melting above your head. The priest's Latin words echo off stone walls while your father stands beside you, grinning because his daughter is about to become someone's asset. Across from you, a man twice your age adjusts his fur cloak and doesn't even look you in the eyes. You're not a bride, you're a contract written in flesh, and everyone in the room knows it. You see, marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't something people fell into. It was something families pushed you into. A nobleman might see a neighboring castle, think, that tower would look good next to mine. And the next thing you know, congratulations. You're engaged. The church called it holy. The kings called it diplomacy. The brides called it silence. And silence was important. Because if you spoke too much, you were ungrateful. If you cried too loud, you were sinful. And if you refused altogether, well, there were plenty of convents waiting for girls who disobeyed. Most of them never came back. But hey, don't worry. They'd make sure you looked beautiful on your wedding day. After all, this wasn't really your day. It was your father's deal and your husband's victory. You were just the ribbon that tied to dynasties. Together, and as the priest says, till death do you part, you realize that part might come a lot sooner than you think. Because medieval marriage wasn't just political, it was dangerous. A single mistake could turn love into accusation, a rumor into execution, and a vow into a death sentence. One whisper of infidelity, one unlucky miscarriage, one night your husband doesn't come home, and suddenly you're not a wife anymore. You're a witch, they said. A good wife was quiet, obedient, and holy. They also said a good wife didn't live too long. But it wasn't just noblewomen who suffered. Down in the villages, the peasants had their own kind of romance. Two poor souls, half-starved, married for survival, not love. Their wedding feast, a half loaf of bread and a prayer. Their honeymoon, a leaking roof and a hungry winter. Yet even there, the rules were the same. The husband owned everything, and the wife worked until her body gave out. Still think marriage was about love. Let's talk about loyalty. In castles and in cottages, fidelity was a luxury few could afford. The men went to war, the women went to confession, and both came home with secrets. The lucky ones kept theirs. The unlucky ones were buried with them, and yet, somehow, they called this life holy. The church preached that a wife's suffering made her closer to God, that obedience was a form of worship, and that silence was, well, the best kind of devotion. So, when you lay beside a man you didn't choose, in a bed that wasn't yours, in a castle you'd never leave, you prayed that heaven was listening. Because nobody else was. There's something haunting about medieval marriage. It wasn't just cruel, it was quiet. All that pain sealed behind silk veils and chapel doors. The paintings show smiling brides and proud knights. But they don't show the bruises, the broken ribs, or the whispered prayers under candlelight. And yet, amidst the silence, some women learned to fight back. Not with swords or daggers, but with secrets. A whispered word to the right priest, a vial of herbs hidden in the kitchen, a forged letter lost in the mail. It wasn't much, but it was power, and in the Middle Ages, even that could cost you your life. But here's the thing, not all of them wanted to escape. Some played the game so well, they ruled from behind the throne. Queens who smiled in court while their enemies drank poisoned wine. Wives who bore heirs for one man while loving another. And widows who never remarried because they'd already won marriage. In those times, wasn't about love or even companionship. It was survival. And survival, in a world built by men, was the closest thing to power a woman could ever have. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into that world, picture the stone halls, the flickering torches, and the echo of vows spoken not in love, but in fear. Remember that behind every wedding veil, there was a story, and not all of them ended with happily ever after. This is the dark truth about medieval marriage. You probably think weddings are beautiful things, flowers, laughter, promises whispered between lovers. But in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't something that bloomed. It was something forged, like a sword, cold, heavy, and built to serve a purpose. You weren't marrying a person. You were merging families, and love had nothing to do with it. In the grand halls of Europe, marriage was war with nicer clothes. Every lord, every duke, every king, they all knew that a daughter was more valuable than a chest of gold. Because she could buy peace, or start a war, dowries were the real currency. Not love, not vows, but gold, land, cattle, sometimes entire villages. A noble father might spend months calculating exactly how much his daughter's hand was worth, like a merchant measuring spices at the market. And the negotiations, those were the real ceremonies. Fathers met under candlelight, whispering numbers as priests looked away. One would say, "She's 15, beautiful, and pious. She'll bring 20 acres and 200 silver marks." The other would nod, calculating silently. He wasn't listening to her virtues. He was picturing her womb, her bloodline, her obedience. Some marriages were planned before the children could even walk. By the time a girl turned 12, her fate was already sealed. She wasn't a child anymore. She was a contract waiting to be signed. And when the day came, the ceremony was brief. The priest spoke Latin words nobody understood. The couple touched hands, and just like that, a girl became a bargaining chip. A father gained favor, a husband gained property, and a bride lost her name. But not every deal was clean. Sometimes, two powerful families would marry their heirs just to stop killing each other. And the hatred never really ended. It simply moved into the bedroom. Imagine that. Two families drenched in blood, their children forced to share a bed, while guards slept outside to make sure the truce stayed intact. That's not romance. That's politics in silk. For peasants, it wasn't much different, only smaller. A farmer didn't need a dowry. He needed labor. A wife was a field hand, a cook, a nurse, a womb. Her wedding dress was her only new possession. Everything else, her time, her body, her freedom, belonged to him. But if you were born noble, you had duties. You were raised knowing your worth wasn't in your heart, but in your blood. You learned to curtsy, to smile, to pray, and to never question what was expected of you. If you were lucky, your husband would at least be kind. If you weren't, well, kindness wasn't part of the contract, Because that's the dark truth no one told you. You didn't need to love your spouse to stay married. You just needed to produce an heir. That was the only thing that mattered. Heirs meant continuity. No heir meant failure. And failure, for a woman, could mean death. If a wife couldn't give her husband a child, the whispers would begin. Maybe she's cursed. Maybe she's a witch. Maybe she's being punished by God. And those whispers had power. They could strip you of your home, your dignity, and your life, all in the name of faith. The church blessed every marriage and every execution that came after. It was a convenient system. You sin, you pay, you confess, you obey. The priests called it divine order. The husbands called it law, and the wives, they called it silence. But make no mistake, the church profited too. Every wedding meant money. Every confession meant a donation. And every broken vow meant punishment, paid in silver or in blood. Priests preached that marriage was sacred, but sacredness, like everything else, came with a price tag. In some regions, the church even charged for special permissions. Want to marry your cousin to keep the family land intact? Pay the fee. Want to marry before Lent? Pay the fee. Want to escape your vows? You guessed it, pay the fee. God's love, it seemed, was negotiable. Even kings weren't exempt. Look at Henry VIII, the man who broke an entire religion just because his wife couldn't give him a son. One woman after another, crowned, condemned, executed, all in the name of divine right. But it didn't start with him. That story began centuries earlier, when marriage stopped being holy and became a weapon. The Crusades made everything worse. Men marched to war, leaving their wives to guard estates they didn't own. Women became stewards, soldiers, prisoners in their own castles. And when the husbands returned, scarred, haunted, sometimes missing pieces of their souls, those women paid for sins they didn't commit. You see, the church taught that a husband's faith could purify his wife. But it also taught that a woman's sin could corrupt a man. So every misfortune, every illness, every crop failure was somehow her fault. In one of the chronicles from 13th century France, a noble woman named Isolde of Courcy was accused of cursing her husband's lands. Her crime? She was barren. The church declared it proof that God had closed her womb as punishment. Her dowry was seized, her name erased, her body locked in a convent. She died there, alone. Praying for forgiveness, she didn't. Oh, that was marriage too. But not every story ended in silence. Some women found ways to fight back, quietly. A clever smile, a carefully chosen word, a deal struck in the shadows. A few learned to manipulate the same system that enslaved them. There was one, Lady Eleanor of Vannes, a baron's daughter married off to a cruel old lord. He thought her meek. He was wrong. While he bragged in the great hall, she bribed his servants, rewrote his ledgers, and when he died mysteriously after a feast, his lands passed directly to her. She lived to 80. They called her the widow wolf, but for every Eleanor, there were 100 Esser. Women traded like coins, silenced by the church, forgotten by history. Their names lost, their stories buried under the weight of men's ambition. Marriage in those centuries was the most beautiful lie of all. A promise of love that was really a contract of power. A blessing that often began with tears. A union sealed not with a kiss, but with a signature in blood. And yet, somehow, society called it holy. So, Next time you picture a medieval wedding, the candles, the bells, the laughter, remember what was really happening. Somewhere behind the veils, a young girl was saying goodbye to her freedom. A father was counting his profits, and a priest was whispering blessings over chains. That's the thing about marriage in those times. It wasn't a celebration of love. It was an economy. And like any good economy, someone always paid the price. So, tell me, when the priest said, "Till death do you part," did he mean hers? You were never meant to be a bride, not yet. You were meant to be a child, to chase the sunlight across a courtyard, to spill milk on your dress and laugh before anyone noticed. But in the Middle Ages, childhood wasn't a rite. It was an interval, a brief pause between being born and being bartered. They called it a marriage. You called it a sentence. It began with whispers. Your mother's voice, careful and trembling, telling you that a lord had noticed your good manners, that his family had promised safety, that this was a blessing. You didn't understand the words, but you understood her eyes, the way they avoided yours. By the time you were 12, you were already property. Your dowry had been negotiated, your wedding dress sewn by women who wouldn't meet your gaze. Every stitch was a prayer, every thread a bargain. And on the morning of your wedding, the sky itself seemed ashamed, grey and heavy, as if the heavens knew what was being done below. The chapel smelled of wax and old wood. Men talked of alliances, of taxes, of peace. You stood between them, trembling hands, bare feet, eyes fixed on the crucifix. When the priest asked if you took this man as your husband, your father squeezed your shoulder hard enough to bruise. You said yes, but you didn't know what it meant. He was older, of course. They always were. He had fought in wars, signed decrees, seen blood. You had seen dolls. When he touched your hand, it felt like winter. Later, the songs began, flutes, laughter, the smell of roasted meat. People danced while you sat silently, a cup of watered wine trembling between your fingers. You were now a wife. Congratulations. Your childhood ended before the music did. Night came. They led you to a chamber draped in velvet and smoke. The door shut behind you like a coffin lid. The man, your husband, smiled politely, the way one might greet a stranger at dinner. And you realized that marriage wasn't just an agreement of families. It was the beginning of obedience. No one talked about the wedding night. It was sacred, they said. Holy. But holiness has a strange shape when it's measured in pain. You learned to be still, to swallow tears, to pray quietly into the pillow so no one would hear. The church said that a wife's duty was to serve, to submit, to bring forth children. And so you did, or you tried to. Some girls never lived long enough to learn how. Bodies too small, bones too soft. Childbirth became their battlefield. They bled on linen sheets while priests recited blessings, as if Latin could stop death from entering the room. If a baby cried, the bells rang. If it didn't, the bells rang slower. Those who survived learned to hide their fear behind politeness. They smiled at banquets, their bellies heavy, their backs aching. They listened to men discuss politics and pretended to understand. They bore child after child, because that was the only thing expected of them, to prove that their bodies worked. And if they failed, if the womb stayed empty, rumors spread like smoke. She's cursed, she's barren, she angered God. Never the husband, never the system, always her. Some begged for miracles, pilgrimages, relics, saints. Others found quieter solutions. herbs hidden in pockets, roots brewed in secret, midwives who whispered that pain could be softened. Sometimes the cure worked, sometimes it killed. Either way, no one asked questions. You might think there was no love in these marriages, but sometimes, strangely, there was, in stolen glances, in brief laughter, in the touch of hands under candlelight. A kind of love born not of choice, but of survival. Two souls trapped in the same script, trying to rewrite a single line before the ending. Yet most of the time, it was loneliness that stayed. Loneliness, thick as the stone walls around you. Loneliness that taught you how to smile without meaning it. Outside the castles, it wasn't much different. Peasant girls were wed, at 13, 14, to men who needed labor, not companionship. Their marriages were small bargains, sealed with bread instead of gold. A shared roof, a shared hunger. Their love was endurance. One chronicler in England wrote of a girl named Agnes, married at 12 to a man of 30. She gave birth at 14. By 16, both she and the child were gone. Fever, the priest said. God's will. But he didn't see the bruises. He didn't smell the moldy straw. He just rang the bell. And still, they said marriage was sacred. If a child bride cried, they told her to pray. If she fainted, they told her to be strong. If she bled, they told her it was natural. And when she died, they told her parents she was blessed because heaven, at least, would not demand a dowry. In time, you would grow old if you lived long enough. You would learn to manage servants, to count coins, to fake smiles at feasts. You would teach your own daughters the same prayers your mother taught you, the ones that didn't save you. And one day, you would watch a carriage arrive for her, and you would say the same words your mother said. This is for your own good. Knowing it wasn't. That's the cruel symmetry of it all. Each generation passed the silence forward like a relic. Mothers became accomplices. Daughters became sacrifices, and the church stood above it all, muttering blessings in gold thread robes. The priests said suffering purified the soul. Maybe that's why the women of the Middle Ages glowed like saints in paintings, because they'd already burned. The child bride was never meant to grow old. She was meant to endure, to obey, to disappear behind veils and Latin hymns. And she did. Her name vanished from records. Her face blurred in frescoes. Her story became a footnote tucked neatly between wars and kings. But every once in a while, a letter surfaces. A confession from a noblewoman. A prayer from a forgotten wife. The words tremble with something ancient. I did as they asked. I was good, I obeyed. But I never forgave them. That's all that's left of her. Ink on paper. Pain turned into history. And somewhere, a scribe copied it carefully, never realizing he was preserving not a sin but a scream. So tonight, when you think of medieval romance, the tapestries, the feasts, the roses, remember her. The girl in white who walked into the chapel and never came back out. The bride whose vows were written for her. The child who prayed for mercy and received silence. Because in the end, the Middle Ages didn't just take her life. They took her story. You didn't mean to fall in love. Not here, not now. Not in a world where love was a sin, and desire was a death sentence dressed in lace. But the human heart is a strange thing. You can bury it under duty, silence, and prayer, and somehow it still finds a way to crawl out. In the Middle Ages, it usually crawled straight into the fire. It began quietly. It always did. A glance in the corridor, that lingered 1 second too long. A hand brushing yours as he passed you the wine. A laugh, honest, unguarded, echoing through the stone hall like a bell that shouldn't have rung. And suddenly you were awake again. After years of cold duty and colder nights, someone had looked at you not as a wife, but as a woman. You told yourself it was harmless, that it meant nothing, that even God might forgive a little warmth. But you knew better. You'd seen what happened to women who mistook attention for affection. They vanished, sometimes into exile, sometimes into graves, and yet the heart doesn't fear what the body remembers. It only hungers. He was not a nobleman, that was part of the danger. A knight, perhaps, or a scholar, someone who shouldn't have looked at you at all. He came to court on business, bowed to your husband, and somehow managed to see through the jewels, the silks, the obedient smile. He saw the loneliness, and he smiled back. It was enough. A smile, in those days, could burn down an empire. At first, you met by accident. In the library, in the garden, always with servants nearby, always pretending not to notice. But your hands shook when his shadow passed over yours. And one evening, under the smell of rain and iron, he said your name, softly, reverently, like a prayer he wasn't supposed to know. That was the moment everything changed. In the centuries that followed, men would write poems about love, but what they never said was how much it cost. Every heartbeat was a risk, every letter a crime, every whisper a possible execution. The castle became your prison. Your husband's footsteps echoed through the halls like thunder. He was older now, suspicious, bitter, the kind of man who thought silence was loyalty and obedience was love. He smelled the change before he saw it, the way you smiled to Isley, the way you hummed while dressing, the way life, faint as it was, had returned to your eyes. He began watching. Not you, directly. That would be too obvious. But the servants, the messages, the candles that burned too long at night. He noticed things that didn't fit, and in a world built on lies, the smallest truth can look like betrayal. Then came the letter. A single folded sheet slipped between pages of a prayer book. It said nothing scandalous, only tomorrow, before dawn. That was enough. The servant who found it was loyal to the wrong man. Within the hour, the guards had your chambers locked. Your husband called the priest, and you, once the lady of the house, became a sinner waiting for judgment. They didn't need proof. Rumor was proof. A whisper could weigh more than gold, and when a noble woman sinned, the church made sure everyone heard her confession. You were dragged to the chapel, barefoot, veiled, trembling. The priest stood over you, reciting scripture, his voice cold as the stone floor. "Confess, daughter," he said. "Confess, and you may be forgiven." But you said nothing, because forgiveness wasn't what you wanted. You wanted him, the man who had risked everything to see you smile. And that was unforgivable. Your husband watched in silence, his jaw clenched, his pride bleeding invisibly beneath his armor of piety. For him, this wasn't about love or betrayal. It was about humiliation. He'd been made a fool, and in a world run by men, a man's reputation was worth more than a woman's life. The punishment came quietly, dressed in mercy. They said you would be sent away, to pray, to repent, to reflect. But the convent they chose was more tomb than temple. A grey fortress where the air smelled of incense and rot. The nuns there didn't ask questions. They knew what you had done, or rather, what men said you'd done. That was enough. Your hair was cut short, your jewelry taken, your name replaced with a number in a ledger. You prayed morning and night, but the words tasted hollow because you weren't praying for forgiveness anymore. You were praying for memory. Sometimes you thought you heard his voice in the corridors, a whisper carried by wind. You knew it wasn't real, but hope is cruel that way. It teaches you to dream even when dreaming hurts. As months turned into years, the world outside forgot you. Your husband remarried. Your children were told you had died of illness. And maybe you had, because the woman who entered that convent wasn't the one who walked out of it. But not every unfaithful heart met punishment. Some escaped it barely. There were women who turned their sins into survival. Queens who learned to lie better than the men around them. Mistresses who controlled kings with secrets instead of seduction. They smiled in portraits and prayed in gold chapels. But they were playing a different game. One where truth was suicide. Take the story of Lady Amara of Savoy. Her husband was a soldier, gone for years at a time. She ruled their lands, managed estates, wrote letters to other nobles. And in the margins of one of those letters, she wrote a line meant for someone else. A lover, perhaps. It said, "The night burns colder without your hand." Her husband never read it, but her brother-in-law did. By morning, the court knew. By nightfall, her lover had been executed, and she was forced to watch. They gave her a choice, public repentance or exile. She chose silence. They buried him in the churchyard, and every Sunday she knelt over his grave, pretending to pray for her own sins, but really praying for his forgiveness. That's what medieval love did to people. It turned devotion into death sentences. It made saints out of the guilty and ghosts out of the innocent. Even the church couldn't keep its hands clean. Priests broke vows behind closed doors. Confessors fell in love with the women they were supposed to save. And the same hands that raised the cross sometimes pulled the curtains shut. The sermons said the heart was deceitful. They weren't wrong. But they forgot to mention that deceit was often the only freedom left. A woman could endure a loveless marriage, but a woman who loved outside it, even once, was beyond redemption. Because in a world where men owned everything, even desire was supposed to belong to them. And yet, through all that fear, love still bloomed quietly, desperately, beautifully. In letters, in glances, in dreams. It bloomed knowing it would die young. Like every forbidden thing, there's a saying from an old monk's diary. God hears the prayers of sinners first, because they have more to lose. Maybe that's why. When you close your eyes tonight, you can still hear her breathing in the dark. The woman who risked everything for one heartbeat of joy. The man who touched her hand knowing it would destroy them both. Their story isn't written in any chronicle. You won't find it in the painted manuscripts or the church's records. But their ghosts remain, whispering through the corridors of ruined castles, in the quiet rustle of parchment, in the cracks of old stone where the torchlight fades. Because betrayal in those days wasn't always punished by death. Sometimes the worst punishment was surviving long enough to remember. You were not born in a castle. You were born in the dirt, and you will die there. But between those 2 points, there is work to be done, mouths to feed, and vows to make. In the Middle Ages, marriage was the one luxury peasants could afford. And even that came with a cost. You don't marry for love. You marry because the winter is long and a second pair of hands means one more chance to survive it. Your dowry is a wooden spoon, a patch of land, maybe a hen. Your wedding feast is watered ale, a loaf of coarse bread, and the priest mumbling Latin while smoke drifts from the hearth. You don't understand the words, but you know what they mean: work, hunger, and another name to answer to. The priest says marriage is holy, but holiness looks strange here. Mud on your knees, a husband who smells of sweat and fear, and a bed of straw that creaks under the weight of exhaustion. There is no romance, only rhythm. So reap, cook, clean, bear, bury, repeat. And when you whisper prayers at night, they are not for love. They are for the rain to stop and the rats to stay out of the grain. Your husband is not cruel. Not exactly. Cruelty takes effort. He simply exists beside you, heavy and tired, his hands shaped like the tools he uses. Sometimes he drinks too much ale and forgets where his strength ends and yours begins. When that happens, you turn your face to the wall and wait for morning. In this village, bruises are not shameful. They are common as calluses. Children come quickly, too quickly. Tiny, shivering things wrapped in rags, half of them never waking past their first frost. Each death makes you quieter. You stop naming them until they survive a year. The priest tells you it is God's will. You want to ask why God needs so many babies, but you swallow the question with your tears. Love, if it exists, hides in small things. The way he shares the last bit of bread without speaking. The way he covers you with his cloak when you cough. The way silence sometimes feels less heavy than words. It isn't enough, but it's something. In a life measured by survival, kindness feels like a miracle. And then there is gossip. Villagers breathe gossip like air. They talk about who works hardest, who owes whom, who might be carrying a bastard. They talk about you too, the quiet wife, the one who doesn't smile much, the one whose fourth baby didn't cry. You pretend not to hear, because gossip in the wrong ears can become accusation, and accusation can become trial. You've seen it before. The woman down the lane accused of witchcraft because her cow gave milk when others didn't. She screamed her innocence until the river filled her lungs. After that, people stopped smiling at miracles. They learned that safety lived in silence. The church watches, always. On Sundays, you kneel beside your husband on cold stone and listen to the priest speak about sin. He says women are weaker vessels. He says obedience is holy. You wonder if God ever listens to women at all. But you keep your head down. Faith is the only luxury that can't be taxed. When plague comes, and it always comes, marriage becomes a kind of alliance with death. You wash your husband's skin with vinegar and herbs, whispering prayers you don't believe. If he dies, you will starve. If you die, he will find another. That is love's arithmetic here. One survives because the other must. Sometimes, at night, you think about leaving. There is a forest beyond the fields, dark and endless. They say witches live there, women who ran away and learned to speak to the wind. Part of you wants to join them, to vanish, to become a story told by firelight. But the morning always brings chores, and stories don't milk the cows. Years pass. The children who lived grow tall and restless. Your hands stiffen. Your hair dulls. You look at your husband and see a stranger who has aged beside you like a reflection in murky water. Neither of you remember the day you married. It's as though the vow was spoken by someone else. Yet on certain nights, when the moon hangs low and the air smells of wet earth, He reaches for your hand, awkward, gentle, and you realize that in a world that never gave you choices, staying became its own kind of rebellion. You endured. You built something out of nothing, and though history will never remember your name, it will rest quietly on the stones of the church you swept, on the fields you tended, on the bloodline you kept alive by sheer will. Asterisk, morning always comes with the same sound, the creak of the door, the low moan of animals waiting to be fed, the cough that reminds you both you're still alive. You rise before the light. The world outside is grey, soft, damp. Frost glitters on the fields like powdered bone. Your husband laces his boots in silence. You tie your shawl, your fingers cracked and red. This is what marriage has become, not words, not love. Just two shapes moving through the same routine until death decides which one to stop first. Sometimes, when you pause at the well, you watch the water tremble and think about the faces of all the women who once stood here. They carried the same buckets. They whispered the same prayers. They vanished into the same ground. It's strange how quickly people are forgotten. By next spring, someone else will be wearing your shoes, and the world will go on as if you never existed. In the tavern, the men laugh about marriage. They call their wives blessings and curses in the same breath. One says his wife nags like a crow. Another says she works harder than his ox. Your husband only drinks and stares at the fire. When someone asks how long you've been together, he shrugs. He doesn't remember, and neither do you. There are moments, though, when time slows. A summer evening when the sky burns orange and your youngest runs barefoot through the mud, giggling. A loaf that rises perfectly though you used old flour. You look at these scraps of happiness and hold them like coins you'll never spend. Because in your world, joy is always borrowed. The priest visits once a month. He asks about your soul, not your stomach. He says obedience will be rewarded in heaven. You nod, but your thoughts drift to the empty cupboard. What use is paradise when the children are hungry? He leaves a blessing and takes a chicken. God's work, he calls it. When storms come, roofs leak and tempers snap. You've learned that love doesn't disappear. It just hides beneath anger, exhaustion, and the smell of wet straw. Sometimes your husband yells. Sometimes you do. Sometimes neither of you speak for days. But when lightning splits the sky and the baby wakes screaming, you both run to the cradle. For a few seconds, the fight, the hunger, the years, all of it fades. You're just two frightened people clutching what little life you've made. Then plague returns. Again, the cart rolls through the village, wheels groaning under its cargo. You watch neighbors carried away, their doors marked with ash. The priest no longer visits. Even faith fears contagion. You nurse your husband, sponging his fever with vinegar, whispering, "Please, not yet." You promise everything, prayers, fasting, even silence forever, if God will just spare him. But God is busy elsewhere. One morning the bed is cold, and you know before you look, the world keeps moving. The mill turns. The hens lay eggs. But you stop. For the first time, you are no one's wife. The neighbors bring bread. The priest brings condolences. The tax collector brings a notice. Without a husband, you are invisible, and in medieval law, the invisible own nothing. They call you widow now, the word whispered like a curse and a compliment. Some pity you. Some fear you. A woman alone is an anomaly, a question no one wants to answer. You could remarry, they say. find protection. But you've spent a lifetime being protected from freedom. Now, with his absence echoing through the cottage, you begin to breathe differently. At night, you sit by the hearth, listening to the wind crawl through the thatch. You think of every woman still bound by the same vow, young girls carrying pails, old wives rubbing ache from their bones. You imagine them standing beside you, unseen, forming a silent congregation. All of you married not to men, but to survival. All of you waiting for a kindness that never came. Yet somewhere deep inside, something small and fierce refuses to die. You start tending a patch of herbs behind the house. Rosemary for memory, sage for cleansing, thyme for courage. The neighbors call it superstition. Let them. For the first time, you own something that answers only to you. On Sundays, you still walk to church. Though you stand at the back now, the priest preaches about obedience. You look at the altar and think, I've obeyed enough. When he blesses the couples kneeling before him, fresh faces full of hope and fear, you almost want to warn them, but you stay quiet. Each must learn on their own that marriage, here, is not a promise. It's a trade. Outside, the fields ripple under wind. You smell earth and ash and the faint sweetness of grain. You think of your husband's hands, rough and clumsy but once kind. Of the children who lived, of the ones who didn't. You whisper their names into the wind and feel it carry them away. No one will record this moment. No monk will write it down. But history is built on such silences. When you finally rise from the bench and close the cottage door behind you, the night settles heavy and calm. Tomorrow will be the same. Work, hunger, prayer. But tonight, for a heartbeat, you allow yourself to imagine another life, one where love was chosen, not endured. Where vows were spoken because hearts demanded them, not fathers or priests. The fire fades, the darkness breathes, and somewhere deep in that darkness, the widow's story begins. The wind in the village changed after your husband's death. At first it carried condolences. Then it began to carry suspicion. Widows are strange creatures in this world, half saint, half threat. The baker leaves stale bread at your door but won't meet your eye. Children whisper that you talk to ghosts. The priest visits again, his voice sweeter than before, his questions sharper. Do you still pray every night? He asks. You nod. He doesn't believe you. Soon, every cough, every spoiled crop, every sick cow begins to trace its way back to your cottage. A man loses his son to fever. He says, your shadow crossed his door that morning. A woman gives birth to a stillborn she, swears she saw you staring at her window the night before. Rumor spreads faster than fire. You become the story they tell to keep fear busy, and yet you do not flee. The fields are still yours to tend. The herbs you planted, rosemary, sage, thyme, thrive under your hands. When someone's wound festers, they come to you at night, whispering, help me. You crush leaves, boil water, whisper a prayer of your own making. By morning they heal. But they don't thank you. They never thank you. They call you healer by candlelight, and witch by sunrise. It's safer that way. One night, you hear a knock. 3 slow raps, deliberate, heavy. You open the door to find a man cloaked in grey, his face hidden beneath a hood. Behind him stands the new Inquisitor sent from the Abbey to root out heresy. You've heard of him. They say he once burned a whole village because the air smelled of the devil. He steps forward, torchlight catching his eyes cold, meticulous, almost curious. "I've heard," he says, "that you speak to the dead." "I speak to no one who listens," you answer. He smiles. That smile carries no warmth. For weeks, he watches you. You see his silhouette near the well, near the edge of the forest, near the churchyard where your husband lies. He talks to your neighbors. He notes every visitor, every light left burning after dusk. And when sickness passes again through the village, he's ready. The widow consorts with demons, he declares. They feed her herbs, and she feeds them souls. The people believe him because it's easier than believing God could hate them without reason. Fear is a comfort. It gives shape to suffering. And so, one morning, they come for you. You don't resist when they bind your hands. You don't scream when they drag you through mud. You've seen enough faces twist with guilt to know that screaming only feeds them. They throw you into the church. Cellar a stone box, smelling of mildew and wine. The Inquisitor visits every night. He asks the same question, over and over. Who gave you your power? You say nothing. Silence, here, is the last act of ownership you have. He shows you instruments, iron claws, tongs, ropes. He doesn't use them, not yet. He wants confession, not blood. He wants to save your soul before he breaks it. But you've already made peace with the idea that souls are overrated things. You remember your husband's cough, the priest's greed, the hunger that never left. If this is the world the soul belongs to, maybe it's better lost. Days turn into nights, and time folds. The Inquisitor grows frustrated. He accuses you of pride, of witchcraft, of consorting with beasts in the woods. You almost laugh. If survival is witchcraft, then every woman you've ever known is guilty. When they finally drag you outside, the sky is grey, the air thick with the smell of burning resin. The villagers have gathered faces you once shared bread with, now twisted by fear. They murmur prayers. Some cry. Some watch with grim fascination. The Inquisitor steps forward, cross raised high. This woman, he says, has turned from God. Let her be purified by flame. You close your eyes, expecting pain, but the world hesitates. The wind shifts. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder grumbles. The torch falters in the Inquisitor's hand. A voice rises from the crowd, a child's voice. "She healed my mother," it says. Then another, trembling. "She saved my baby." Then silence. No one moves. The Inquisitor's jaw tightens. He looks at you, then at the people, and for a moment, uncertainty cracks his mask. You see it fear, real and human. Because if you are innocent, he is damned. If you are guilty, he is righteous. But if he can no longer tell the difference, his world collapses. He lowers the torch. The villagers murmur again, confused, restless. He turns away without a word. You are left kneeling in the mud, ropes biting your wrists, smoke curling round your face. That night, they release you quietly, without ceremony. No one helps you stand. No one dares look at you. The Inquisitor leaves the next day, heading for another village, another sinner. You go home. Your cottage still smells of herbs and ashes. You light a small fire and sit beside it, your hands trembling. You realize that freedom feels no different from exile. Outside, the rain begins against, low, steady, endless. You whisper a prayer, not to God, but to the earth itself. The same soil that takes, that grows, that remembers. And somewhere, under that wet, cold ground, your husband sleeps, your neighbors rot, your name fades, but something of you remains. A rumor, a memory, a warning dot in the villages beyond. When the wind howls and the crops fail, they still whisper about the widow who defied the flame. They say her spirit walks the fields at night, searching for the Inquisitor who almost burned her. They say when you feel guilt in your bones, when your sins start to taste like smoke, that's her breath on your neck. Seasons shift, and the village forgets you at least. That's what they tell themselves. But memory in these lands doesn't die. It lingers like damp air inside a locked cellar, and the whispers grow taut. At first, the stories are simple. Children say they saw you near the well on a moonless night, your shawl fluttering, though the wind was still. Farmers claim your herbs still grow wild, where your hands once worked the soil plants that heal wounds faster than prayer, but turn milk sour if picked at dawn. The old women, bent and blind, swear they can hear your steps in the frost when they light candles for their dead. The church calls these stories blasphemy, but secretly, even the priests keep salt by their doors now. The cottage remains, half-eaten by ivy. Its chimney leans like a neck under a blade, and the door groans when the wind pushes through. Inside, the hearth lies cold, but the air still smells faintly of sage and smoke. Some say they've seen a figure there, thin, barefoot, face hidden beneath a hood. Others claim the house itself breathes when the fog rolls in. The Inquisitor never forgot you. Though he travelled on, purging town after town, your silence haunted him. At night, when the torches burned low and the screams quieted, he'd see your eyes in the dark and broken, unreadable. He began to question his faith, his duty, himself. And in those questions, the first cracks appeared. Months later, he returned to your village, but the people had changed. They didn't cheer his arrival this time. They watched from behind shutters. They'd learned that fire doesn't cure. Furit feeds it. The Inquisitor found your cottage empty, though the floor bore strange mark circles burned into the wood, like candle wax that had flamed too hot. He swore he heard a whisper, soft as breath. "You saved me." He spun around. The doorway was empty. Only the sound of rain slipping through the roof. That night, he dreamed of you standing in the same field where he once condemned you. But now you were luminous eyes, pale as moonlight, voice steady and low. You wanted confession, you said. "Here it is. I forgive you." When he awoke, his torch had gone out, and his hair once black had turned to ash dot after that. They said he was never the same. He refused to hold the cross. He stopped speaking during Mass. Some whispered that he'd seen the devil, but he knew better. He'd seen his own reflection in the dark, and it had smiled back. Years passed. The widow's name was lost to parchment, but her shadow grew longer. In some villages, they called her a saint. In others, a spirit of vengeance. Women whispered her name during childbirth. Men invoked her before harvest. And when the wind howled at night, mothers told their children, "Be kind, or the widow will come for you." But she didn't come for cruelty. She came for the forgotten. There were reports, centuries later, of cloaked figures visiting the graves of the poor. Coins appeared on tombstones. Candles lit themselves at the gallows. And in one forgotten monastery, a monk claimed he saw her kneeling before a cross made of roots, whispering words he couldn't understand. When he approached, she turned to him and, where her face should have been, there was only light. Perhaps she was never meant to die. Perhaps her punishment became her transcendence. Because history, for all its cruelty, has a strange way of making martyrs out of the misunderstood. Centuries blurred. The village became a town. The church crumbled. The fields turned to cobblestone. Yet the legend remained. They built a fountain where her well once stood. On winter nights, the water sometimes runs red. The townsfolk call it the widow's tears. Scholars call it mineral runoff. But the children know. The children still whisper before they sleep. She watches us. And perhaps they're right. Because every story about her begins the same way. A woman wronged. A world afraid. And a silence that refuses to burn. One cold evening in a newer age. A scribe finds an old manuscript in the abbey's library. Its pages are brittle, its ink faded to rust. The title is half-earist, but the first line reads, "Let it be known, the fire that meant to purify only revealed truth." He reads on. It tells the tale of a widow accused of witchcraft, of a village swallowed by guilt, of an inquisitor undone by mercy. But the last page is blank save for one sentence. Etched faintly in the corner, she walks still between faith and flame. The scribe looks up. The candles flicker though the air is still. A cold hand brushes his shoulder. He turns no one. Only the faint scent of herbs, long dead but still remembered. He closes the book and whispers, "Amen." Outside, the wind stirs the trees, and for a moment, in the reflection of the windowpane, a woman stands behind him, half in shadow, half in light, smiling that same strange smile that once silenced an inquisitor. The flame trembles. The candle gutters out. Darkness returns, and the story begins again. So tonight we've walked through centuries of silence, through stone walls and candlelight, through the breath of the living and the whispers of the forgotten. You've met a servant who bowed until her soul broke. You've seen a widow who refused to burn, and through them both, you've glimpsed the heart of the medieval world, a place that believed pain could be holy, and obedience was salvation. But maybe that world isn't as distant as it seems, because even now, somewhere deep inside us, a small voice still whispers, "Be good, be silent, endure." It's the same voice the church used to tame its people, the same voice husbands used to own their wives, the same voice that told a grieving widow to smile while the flames reached her feet. History remembers kings and knights and inquisitors, but it is built quietly, invisibly, on the backs of those who were never meant to be remembered. The servants who cleaned their master's sins from stone floors, the wives who outlived their love, the women who learned to pray in languages the church didn't approve of. They were not heroes. They were human, and that's far more dangerous, because truth, when buried under obedience, doesn't vanish. It mutates. It becomes legend. It becomes a curse. And sometimes it becomes a warning. So when the wind howls tonight, or when you hear a creak in your walls that sounds too human to be the house settling, don't be afraid. It might just be history, reminding you that silence has a memory too. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the widow's voice, still gentle, still defiant, whispering through time, "The fire did not purify me. It only showed who was truly burning. Thank you for staying till the end." If her story stayed with you, leave a light in the comments or a candle in your window, because the night may forget our names, but the shadows, they always remember. Good night, traveler. Sleep well if you can.